The year 2020 has been a challenging one on many fronts thanks to the ongoing coronavirus pandemic. It initially sent global diplomacy into a tailspin, but the world adapted and started getting used to a new normal. Despite the pandemic, many important summits were conducted, albeit virtually. At these summits, India played a leading role in discussing possible solutions posed by the SARS-CoV-2. Not just on the pandemic front, but China posed several challenges for India on the border and even in the Indian Ocean. But India stood up to the bully and took some bold steps. New Delhi was joined by several like-minded countries to try and move away from China. The Quad has been strengthened and Australia joined the Malabar exercises in 2020. There was much more that transpired through the year as well. But in this edition of India's World, we will look back at New Delhi's foreign policy in 2020. Joining me on the program today are Professor C. Rajamohan, Director, Institute of South Asian Studies, Singapore; Prabhu Dayal, former ambassador; and Professor Swaran Singh, Chairperson, Centre for International Politics, JNU. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this special edition of India's World. Professor Rajamohan, let me begin the program with you first. How would you look back at the year 2020 and look at India's foreign policy? What were the key highlights for you?
I think, Frank, you summarized the main developments of the year. I think the pandemic, which has had a severe impact on India's economy, is going to have a significant effect on the way India does business with the rest of the world. While the contraction of the economy is probably a short-term one, the longer-term consequences are going to come from India's decision to formalize a strategy which is focused on self-reliance or Atmanirbharata. We've seen India walk out of the Regional Comprehensive Partnership, which is an Asia-wide agreement, in 2019, and in 2020 it became a formal decision. But aligned to that has been an Indian strategy now, which actually formally states strengthening India's domestic capabilities is a big priority, and that its international economic engagement will depend on that. Of course, the government has clarified Atmanirbharta does not mean isolation. But on China, I'm sure Swaran Singh is going to say a lot more things. But I think we've reached a breaking point with China, because we had a series of crises in 2013, 2014, 2017. But this time around, I think the sense in Delhi, China has really decided to break the old norms of keeping peace and tranquility on the border. And now we have a confrontation that's almost entered the 8th month and with no sign of its resolution. So India-China relationship, which enjoyed 3 decades of relative stability and expanding economic engagement, is going to now move into a situation where economic decoupling, a conscious Indian strategy, as well as finding ways to balance China are the consequences of that Chinese aggression in Ladakh.
Right. Okay. So taking the discussion forward now, Ambassador Prabhu Dayal, let me come across to you and get a reaction in from you as far as China is concerned. We saw the entire Galwan incident. We saw how India, stood strong against China as well and took some bold decisions and some bold steps. Your thoughts on that?
Well, Frank, you have very correctly summarized the foreign policy perspective for 2020. I would just like to say that 2020 was a very successful year for Indian foreign policy, because we sent across a very clear message to China that we will not be cowed down by it or by anyone else. Now, foreign policy is shaped by national interests, and national interests are very closely bound with national security. China and Pakistan both threaten our national security. And we sent this very clear message to China that though we were battling with the COVID crisis, we would take on China as best as we can as a nation. And I think we were able to do so. The Chinese took advantage of the fact that we were battling COVID and that our economy was going through a period of crisis. And therefore, what it tried to do was to extend the line of actual control westwards. And It has always been saying that it wants the line of actual control to be alongside the 1959 claim line. And this is something that we have rejected. The Chinese tried to push its perspective. We stood up, and very significantly, we occupied certain heights. And that made the Chinese wake up, because far from trying to push us down and far from making us kneel down, we were now in a position to tell the Chinese that we occupied strategic advantages. So as I see it, we not only stood up to the challenge posed by the Chinese, but we also sent across a clear message that we were entrenching ourselves, we were prepared to brave the winter, and we will stick it out, but we will not buckle down. That, I think, is a very, very major success.
Absolutely. And building on what the ambassador has just said, Professor Swaran Singh, India definitely stood up to China, stood up to Beijing's might. Several other countries from around the world also wanted to join in. There were talks initially about how supply chains need to be, widened. It can't just be China-centric. Several countries also tried to move away from China, but did not manage to do so at the end of the day. I mean, they're still so dependent on China. India is the only one who seems to have completely, distanced itself from China. Why is that so, do you think? Why haven't the others been able to do that?
Very clearly, India is the largest, both in terms of size of territory, in terms of population, in terms of economic power. It's the largest neighbor of China. And therefore, not only India stood up to China challenge, but that was also being seen clearly by the rest of China's periphery. So we saw year 2020 shifting Indian foreign policy. For example, India's hydroxychloroquine or paracetamol were going to 150 countries now. And of course, India's entire medical health services workforce and production capacity is now in case of producing vaccine, for example. They were the new kind of elements of Indian foreign policy that brought India a certain influence, access, and at least visibility for sure. So if on the one side we saw that the hyperactive foreign visits of Prime Minister, which had become the defining feature of Indian foreign policy over years, did not take place because of pandemic in 2020. And there were other elements that came to the forefront in still India wielding influence in global decision making. And you mentioned yourself the fact that, long kind of dysfunctional SAARC summit happened online. India was not seen as engaging non-alignment so clearly. Non-alignment summit happened and Indian Prime Minister joined. So India was able to join and initiate, including G20 meeting to begin with, a large number of initiatives and make it appear as normal as diplomacy was before a pandemic came into being. So whereas pandemic did dwarf some of the initiatives and visibility of Indian foreign policy at the global scale, which is where India is kind of dealing with China. It's not just on the border. India today is dealing with China at the regional and global level, and there you saw pandemic opened up new opportunities for India. And therefore, not only we kind of fast forward our engagement with Quad, upgraded it, and our sort of foundational agreements have been completed with the United States. So India is clearly seen as very clearly engaged. And very quickly, the last good example to give will be how 184 countries in a secret ballot supported India's case for 8th time to be sitting as non-permanent member on Security Council. Look at, by contrast, in Human Rights Council, China after 2016 joined again this year. But of the 5 members who were elected, China received the least number of votes. So at global scale, when you measure how India is being engaged and how China is being engaged, that also carries a certain amount of impact as to how negotiations and force posturing happens on the border. Of course, it is unfortunate that this engagement has not happened, but in that sense, India standing up to China has kind of been a success story of 2020 foreign policy to me. And of course, we have had also a very, very articulate and experienced foreign minister. He's also been repeatedly underlining how we are drifting gradually from the dogmatic, ideological to pragmatic to sort of being relatively sort of hedging and sort of pessimist to more realistic, and then showing the willpower which guides Indian foreign policy today far more decisively. So in many ways, 2020 would be seen as a game changing, both in the way foreign policy is conceived of and how diplomacy is conducted.
Absolutely. All right. Let's take the discussion forward now and let's build on a couple of aspects. Professor Rajmohan, let's talk about India's medicine diplomacy or vaccine diplomacy or whatever you want to call it. India, though the virus did not originate in India, India was part of several solutions, maybe not permanent solutions, but considered to be solutions at that point in time, be it hydroxychloroquine or paracetamol, or just giving those generic drugs to the immediate neighborhood and making it available to everyone else as well. So would you see that as a win or a gain really as far as India's foreign policy is concerned? Can we convert this goodwill to gains in the future?
Yeah, I think in many ways you can call it the health diplomacy. Because like everybody else, India was caught by surprise when the pandemic hit it. But I think since then, India has used its existing capabilities in the pharmaceutical sector, for example, on the production of hydroxychloroquine, to be able to respond to the demands of the other states. But that's only the first step. What we've also seen was India was very short of the production of PPE and other equipment so badly needed for managing the COVID pandemic. And there we've seen the focus on self-reliance do a significant attempt at expanding production. And now India has become actually an exporter of PPEs, ventilators, and other equipment that is needed to manage the pandemic. But as you look ahead, I think is it going to be even more interesting for India because India is a major center for the production of vaccines. We might not be doing all the R&D. Some R&D is going on, but I think India is a major center for the production of vaccines. And as vaccines come into play, I think India will have a big role in producing them for its own use as well as for global use. And then there is the other dimension. India has also now taken the chair of the World Health Assembly, which is not an executive position, but as India sits on top of the board that runs the World Health Organization. So I think India has a role now to shape the post-pandemic future in terms of how the relationship between major countries are going to work out. And also, I think we must also keep trying to get China to take some responsibility for what happened. And because this is not going to be the last pandemic, so what are the kind of rules that we can devise for future management of pandemic? All these will constitute what you might call the health diplomacy, which has become a major part. And I think finally, one of the shortcomings we have with our pharmaceutical sector is our dependence on China for the intermediaries, what is called the APIs, which we became dependent on China. But I think there is a conscious effort now that the full cycle of vaccine production, producing various pharmaceuticals can be done in India. And there, you mentioned, I think Professor Swaran Singh also mentioned, working with others to build sustainable, resilient, trustworthy supply chains in the pharmaceutical sector. There is, I think, a huge opportunity has opened up for us in working with other like-minded nations. Can we produce a new supply chains for the global pharmaceutical industry?
Absolutely. So let me talk about another aspect as well. Ambassador, let's talk about some of the major summits that took place and India's role at these summits as well. Let's start with the UN. India was, brought up several issues there, spoke about terrorism and how terrorism is a problem, is a menace for the entire world, and also UN reforms.
Well, you very rightly said that terrorism is a menace for the entire world, and India has been raising its voice on this issue very, very consistently. Now, terrorism for us is a very, very serious problem because Pakistan has made it a cornerstone of its foreign policy to wage proxy war against India by using non-state terrorist actors. Now, what has started to change in recent years is not just that we raise our voice in a very effective manner at international fora, but that we have started to attack terrorist bases inside Pakistan. That is a major success of our security and foreign policy. We have been able to convey to the world that Pakistan, in fact, has been helping these non-state actors, and therefore we have no other method available to us than to destroy the terrorist bases which exist in Pakistan. And by and large, the world has supported us in this regard. You may recall that we have been withstanding these attacks for a very long time. There have been attacks like the one on our parliament, the Mumbai terror attacks, the Pathankot terror attack, the Uri terror attack, and last year the Pulwama terror attack. But what has changed in recent years that we have decided to attack these terrorist bases inside Pakistan and make it pay. Significantly, we have also utilized the international opinion, which is in our favor, to rein in Pakistan, particularly by putting it on the grey list of the Financial Action Task Force. Now, Pakistan has not been reined in, but the international efforts which are being made in this regard are beginning to have effect. Very significantly, in the international context, we are now going to be a member of the Security Council, though in a non-permanent capacity. And there is significant international opinion that is building to the effect that India should find a place as a permanent member. So we have been able to play a very decisive international role. You referred to the international summits which India has been attending. Let me mention that last month alone, in November 2020, India attended 5 major summits, though, of course, these were through virtual interaction. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit, the ASEAN Summit, the BRICS Summit, the G20 Summit, and the SCO Summit. Now, these were all summits which India attended in 1 month alone, and where we were able to outline to the world what our global role is and the manner in which we are using our scientific abilities to combat COVID. So India has been able to strengthen its abilities to play a global role and at the same time combat challenges which emanate to it from across the border in a very effective manner.
Absolutely. So, Professor Swaran Singh, let's talk about the Quad as well and talk about the Indo-Pacific and the Indian Ocean and how India has played a significant role there too.
Again, you see India's engagement with Quad, which saw upgradation to ministerial level talks, is guided by China, because China has emerged as a major challenge in Indian Ocean. And in the Quad, India is the only country that has direct impact of what happens in Indian Ocean. Australia and Japan are much more focused on the Pacific and, of course, are in alliance relationship with the United States. So India's locus for upgrading engagement with the Quad is partly geared by the fact again that China has emerged as a challenge in Indian Ocean. And now with the ratcheting up of border situation, we have seen India increasingly harmonizing with the American interests in how to manage the security architecture of the Indo-Pacific region, and how Quad increasingly is becoming the central axis of the new security infrastructure or architecture in that region. And people are even saying that potentially Quad, or at least Quad Plus, could replace ASEAN as being on the driving seat in regional security architecture of that larger Indo-Pacific region, because over time ASEAN has been engaged and cultivated by Chinese. You will remember the East Asian financial crisis onwards, how the U-turn took place. ASEAN, which was created to contain China at one stage in 1960s, in 1990s, it was engaging China as a friend. So the fundamental principle of ASEAN being on the driving seat was that it will never hurt the core interests of major powers. Now, on the one hand, China has emerged as a major power. On the other hand, China has also emerged as a friend of ASEAN. And it's not normally seen that ASEAN members, despite having serious disputes in South China Sea, we don't see normally ASEAN standing up to China the way, for example, India stood up to China. So India's engagement with Indo-Pacific is both a trigger as also a reflection of India's inching closer to United States in that sense. And I think that is partly again triggered by our China challenge that we are trying to engage here. But nevertheless, when you sort of come closer to United States, it's a package deal. You come closer to about 24 friends and allies of United States. So that adds on to your stature and visibility at the global scale. And that is why you saw one after another virtual summits happening by Prime Minister Modi with either the Japanese Prime Minister or the Australian Prime Minister. Australia joining the Malabar naval exercises, which are now becoming the Quad naval exercises. So in that sense, quadrilateral has moved from just being a security dialogue to now not just security and strategic, but also decoupling. Again, China, India, Australia, trilateral resilience initiative, if you remember. So Quad is gathering much more critical mass. And India is playing a kind of a very, very definitive role in engaging Quad in that sense. So potentially, I think Quad will become again a kind of a major engagement of India's foreign policy, in which again, I think 2020 will be the year which will be, showcasing that inflection point where India, gave away that long-term reluctance of not really engaging openly and decisively with the Quad, which is often seen as aimed at containing China, to becoming far more robust and open about this. So
Right.
Quad would be again another major inflection point on India's foreign policy for 2020.
Okay. Time now to get closing comments from all my panelists, starting first with you, Professor Rajamohan. From a strategic point of view, is it safe to say that we've done reasonably well in 2020, but probably on the one front that we have, I wouldn't say faltered, but we could have done better is probably trade, because, we've been trying to sort out these FTAs. Of course, we know what happened with RCEP, but FTAs with, say, Europe, with Australia, or with some of the other countries as well.
No, I would just say three things. I think one, with China, though the Chinese threat had been growing over the last many decades, I think there was an ambivalence, hesitation to confront the problem that India was facing from China, growing power imbalance, Chinese expansionism. So there was a hesitation to directly face up to the problem. So in some senses, what the Chinese aggression did was now there's no longer any confusion in Delhi. I think what is the kind of threat we face from China and what are the kind of responses we need to do. And I think that is a significant departure that has happened. Second, I think on the US, Professor Soren Singh has already said, there was a hesitation in drawing closer to the US. And I think what we've seen is that hesitation has now disappeared. And of course, it is not going to be, India is not going to be an Australia to the United States or a Japan to the United States. It'll be an independent partnership, but I think there is no longer that self-doubt, half step forward, 2 steps back, that kind of an approach that we saw for many years. Today, I think there is going to be a robust engagement with the US on our own terms and for mutual benefit. And that also extends to now one of the new changes that have taken place is really the new interest in Europe that India is now taking, that Europe is going to be a major partner. France has emerged as a very reliable strategic partner, which blocked a lot of the Chinese-Pakistani initiatives in the Security Council to take Kashmir question there. So I think Europe, we're going to see a lot more of Europe in India's foreign policy. That's again a major thing. And on the trade, as you said, it is not a setback, I would say. It is a signaling a different strategy. In 1991, we undertook reforms while opening up our market to the others. I think we did not do enough to strengthen domestic manufacturing capabilities. Now, India is saying we're not going to, abandon 91. What we're doing is we're going to strengthen our capabilities. So how we deal with trade is going to be different. We want to be part of the supply chains. We want to engage all the major trading actors, but decoupling from China, strengthening ties with our partners, other partners, and more importantly, using collaborations to strengthen India's manufacturing sector. That is a big change that has taken place. The effects of this will be visible over the longer term.
Absolutely. Ambassador, 2020, would you say, posed a different kind of a challenge as far as India's diplomacy is concerned?
No, challenges for Indian diplomacy have always been around. But what compounded the challenges were, first of all, the impact of COVID on India's internal system, particularly its economy. And secondly, the ganging together in a very deliberate manner by China and Pakistan. Because China saw how India was engrossed with the problem of COVID, and together with Pakistan, it thought that this was a good opportunity to pressurize India in every manner possible. Now, this challenge is not going to come down. And therefore, for our diplomacy, combating the twin menace from China and Pakistan will continue to be a forefront challenge in the coming year. I must also mention that problems regarding trade are not likely to ease because other countries have been adversely affected by COVID and are unlikely to be so open-minded in regard to trading with other countries. So I think we have a tough year lying ahead of us, but given the sort of resolve which we have so shown in 2020, I think that we can put it past all challenges that we confront.
All right. And Professor Swaran Singh, close the show for us with your concluding remarks.
Thank you. Year 2020, for example, saw some decisive changes in India's diplomatic tactics, but not in strategy. So fundamentals of foreign policy have not changed. Some elements, some leverages of diplomacy that were very, very prominent before were marginalized because of pandemic, but we also saw pandemic throwing up new elements of foreign policy, new leverages of diplomacy, and we discussed how health diplomacy has emerged as one of the major levers of India seeking and wielding influence. So of course, India was inching closer to United States very clearly, but we also see that India today is holding presidency of Shanghai Cooperation Organization, of BRICS nations, which also means the trilateral of Russia, India, China strategic triangle. So India's engagement with Russia and China remains equally important in foreign policy engagements of India. And therefore, you will notice that this kind of role that India wishes to look for itself in being a stabilizing power, in being a kind of a supporter of multilateralism in Asia, or a net security provider using institutionalization and norms of foreign policy at the global level. That element, I think, the fundamentally which defines Indian foreign policy has not moved away in 2020. But yes, we have seen a drift in terms of how tactics of diplomacy are conducted. And in that sense, there is a certain maneuvering that happened in 2020. But potentially, yes, they could become decisive if China challenge doesn't get resolved in coming years. But as of now, I think there is a certain, as Professor Rajmohan mentioned, reluctance to me that continues even today in ensuring that we are balancing our engagement with almost as many powers in as many sectors as possible. And we are still extremely shy of taking sides. That maneuvering space for India may have decreased in year 2020, but India has still continued to manage that maneuvering in engaging as many nations as it can.
Right. All right. On that note, then, I'll call it a wrap on this edition of India's World. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. What's coming out of this discussion is that 2020 has indeed been an extremely challenging year as far as India is concerned. But Indian diplomacy has stood strong. Even though the virus did not originate from India, India was part of several solutions around the world as far as the problem caused by COVID-19 was concerned. India has led the way and led from the